Chapter 4 The Sapling, Part 2. It wasn't the thunder that woke Aaron Harding. It was the dream. Well, the memory of a dream. But as he burst upright in his hotel bed, he realized that he could no more recall this one than the countless before. He looked around the dark and disheveled room. A suitcase lay open against the far wall, clothing spilling over the sides. If Evie were here, she'd have something to say. What would the world think if they could see the great King of Hearts being such a slob? He smiled at the thought, but his mind was simply too occupied to concern himself with tidiness. Avak had been missing for the better part of a month, which could only mean he was dead. But why? Sander, at least, had been a hero long enough to have made some dangerous enemies, but the otter was just a kid. He didn't have an enemy in the world. Could someone have learned Aaron's plan for him? And then there was this Alan Cale kid. Einar was insistent upon him, and the young fox seemed a suitable candidate. Not ideal, but suitable. Avak had been a perfect fit, and now that the otter was dead, possibly because of the plan, how could he justify the use of someone 2 years younger and far less equipped? He rubbed an enormous paw over his muzzle and stood, scratching above his tail as he moved toward the bathroom. As he went about his business, he tried once again to recall the dream. He'd been flying. That part wasn't so unusual. He'd been able to fly since he was 19 years old. But the way he'd been flying was strange, gliding ghost-like through the air, straight toward something, a stone building of some kind, maybe a chapel? He was being chased by some enormous thing, like an oblong boulder that had been rolled end over end. The object was making a wet, vacuous noise so loud it might have been roaring through a megaphone. But the harder he tried to concentrate on the details, the hazier they seemed. Yet he knew, or at least he thought he knew, what these dreams meant, and the dreams were becoming more frequent. That made the plan all the more urgent. He washed his paws, flipped on the coffee pot, and examined himself in the mirror.
"You are getting old, Lion,"
he thought, taking in the white bristles along his muzzle and the desaturated tone of his dreadlocked mane, which hung in ropes around his overlarge head. The phone rang, bringing him out of his reverie. He crossed to the bedside table in 2 strides and caught up the receiver.
"Hello?"
"Oh, Aaron, thank God,"
said a familiar yet panicky voice.
"Toby?"
the lion responded.
"What is it? What's wrong?"
"There's trouble,"
Toby said, his voice breaking.
"A train hijacking, right in your area."
Aaron sat heavily down on the edge of the unmade bed.
"It's all right, Toby. Just tell me the details."
He listened intently as Toby filled him in, his eyes falling upon the clothing draped over the open suitcase, fixating on the heart-shaped emblem sewn into the fabric.
"Hurry, Aaron,"
Toby implored.
"I'm on my way,"
Aaron responded, and he set the receiver down. Rubbing his face with his large paws, he slapped his knees and stood. As he finished suiting up, he took one last look at his reflection, this time with the slightest hint of a smile. The image of a stone chapel came back to him, and a toppling object just at his tail, and that loud, vacuum-like sound. It seemed to crescendo, coming back to him clearer than ever. He flicked the coffee pot back off. The aroma would have to suffice. It was going to be a rough day. Toby had never been a good liar. Jack Roberts was beginning to lose consciousness. The back of his shirt had caught on something, and he was now hanging like a crook at the gallows, his feet dangling mere inches above the blurred rush of gravel. Then a shadow blocked out the light. Looking up and to the right, he could just see the pig climb out through the doorway and grab onto a ladder along the body of the train. Was he coming for Jack? Was he going to kick him loose? Instead, the pig turned upward, climbing toward the roof of the train. A voice called out, "Jack!" Twisting his neck as far right as he could, Jack saw slender pink fingers stretching toward him from the same door. He reached upward weakly, but the paw was out of his range. Lower me a bit, Dr. Walraven shouted. The paw reached down again, getting low enough to brush Jack's shoulder. He raised his arm, a tingling numbness spreading to his fingertips. The paw closed around his own, and as he was pulled upward, another pink paw grabbed roughly onto his shirt. With a great heave, he rose out of the rain and crashed down on top of Dr. Walraven. The rat was gasping for breath, but flung both arms around Jack and mumbled, "Thank God! Oh, thank God!" Jack trembled and whimpered, looking around the room as he brushed tears down into the fur of his cheeks. Nathan was slumped against the opposite wall, both paws joined over his eyes. He, too, was trying to catch his breath. Dr. Walraven slid out from under Jack and hobbled to the doorway, leaning out and looking upward. "He's gone," he said. He then turned down to the spot where Jack had been hanging. "Jack, come here," he called, looking back over his shoulder at the bunny and extending a paw. Jack rose slowly and took small, hesitant steps toward the door. Dr. Walraven put an arm reassuringly around his shoulder and drew him slowly toward the opening. "There," the doctor said, pointing to the spot where Jack's shirt had become hooked. "You see it?" A slender brownish-gold protrusion extended out from the body of the train, just below the door. "It's part of the fin the train uses to swim," Dr. Walraven laughed. "It seems to have malfunctioned. It failed to close all the way." He moved back into the room, pulling Jack with him, and slammed the door. "I thought we'd lost you." He hugged the bunny. "That was lucky, wasn't it?" Jack looked up at him, hiccuping another small sob, then rested his head against the doctor's stomach and considered his words. They moved into the next car, where the passengers were mostly awake and looking uneasily toward the roof. "Yes, we heard it too," a goat woman was saying across the aisle to a grandmotherly finch wearing a bonnet. "It sounded like gunfire." "That's what I thought," the finch replied. Jack looked toward Dr. Walraven, who gave him a reassuring smile and crouched down to eye level. "Jack, I need to go and get Alan. It seems the danger is moving in his direction." He looked up toward Nathan. "Would you mind keeping an eye on him?" The squirrel looked as if he might collapse or vomit, but he gave a rather jerky nod. Dr. Walraven rose and began back down the aisle toward the next passenger car. Nathan dropped into an empty seat and put a paw over his face. 2 weeks, he mumbled. "Just 2 more weeks. Spring break, no job, no worries, no all-fours train hijacking." He was shaking all over. Perhaps Jack had shivered and cried everything out, for now he felt like doing neither. Out the window the sky was still black, but with a faint blue rim to distinguish the mountains from the storm clouds. Dawn was coming. The storm was ending. From the far end of the car, thunderous footsteps came crashing along the roof toward the engine, then came to a sudden stop just overhead. The passengers watched the ceiling in anxious silence. There was a muffled yell, then the unmistakable cracking of gunfire, coupled with another yell like a war cry. Then a louder sound. It began in the ceiling itself, the sound of metal scraping metal. The car vibrated with the noise. The roof began to tear, as though invisible hands were peeling it back. Sparks showered down as the tear grew, exposing the morning sky, opening the car like a sardine can. There was another shout, this one much more audible and profane, the pig's voice. But his cry was cut short with a thud. The metal had rolled up like a carpet, a large lump at its center. The muffled yells of the pig could be heard from inside the roll like a profanity-shouting bulge in an anaconda's belly. Footsteps thundered once more from the rear of the train, then with a burst pounded off the rolled-up roof, and a shadow flew gracefully across the gap. Jack watched as the unmistakable silhouette, with its brush-ended tail and dreadlocked mane, passed over his head. Applause had burst out among the relieved passengers. Jack gripped Nathan's arm. "King!" he shouted over the roar of the train engine. "It's King himself!" "Jack!" Dr. Walraven had returned and was hurrying toward the bunny. "Are you all right?" Alan walked just behind the doctor, his paws in his jeans pockets as he stared up at the gaping hole in the ceiling. "I'm fine," Jack nodded. Then he erupted with excitement. "King was here!" Dr. Walraven turned toward the open ceiling with a look of concerned calculation. "Is something wrong?" Alan asked. "Well," the doctor started, "we're getting quite near to Sapley. Another 10 minutes and we'll be there." "That's good, right?" Nathan the attendant said hopefully. "Why aren't we slowing down?" the doctor said. "What was it the pig said?" He continued, more to himself. "Maybe we could use them as bait." And then after he tossed Jack out the door, the weasel came out and said, "He's here," and the pig climbed to the roof. He fell silent for a moment, then turned slowly toward the front of the train. "It's a trap." As if in response to these words, a loud roar bellowed through the open ceiling. All heads turned upward. "Wouldn't want to be the hijackers right about now," the goat husband said with a nod to the finch, who smiled nervously. There was another roar. The crowd around Jack continued to express relief at their salvation, but to Jack it sounded like King was in trouble. Alan seemed to have the same thought. "We need to do something," the fox said, looking defiantly up at Dr. Walraven. The doctor shook his head. "There's nothing we can do, Alan. King is more than capable of—" He stopped suddenly. The car had given a heavy lurch, which was accompanied by another, even more pronounced roar. Passengers jumped to their feet in alarm, filling the aisle. Jack took the opportunity. He pushed his way between the goat and finch, straight through the intercar doors. "Jack! Jack, wait!" But Dr. Walraven's words were drowned out as the second set of doors slid closed. The light in the engine room seemed even redder than before, bouncing off a thick cloud of steam. Sparks were now falling from the ceiling. He passed below them like a curtain as he entered the room. King didn't know this was a trap. He must be warned. But as Jack neared the door leading into the control room, the train gave a heavy lurch, paired with the same metallic tearing that had sounded when the roof had torn open. Reaching for the door handle, he lost his balance and tumbled against the wall. He spun to face the rear of the car, but where the intercar doors had been, a gaping hole grinned out onto open air. His head spun at the sight. "Wait!" he cried as he ran back to the opening. The engine and first passenger car were now separated by a gap of 10 feet, and the divide continued to expand as the passenger cars lost speed. Jack could see Dr. Walraven struggling desperately with the intercar door, which seemed to be jammed, his wide eyes fixed on Jack's. "No, no, no!" the bunny bleated, his voice choking with horrified sobs. Overhead he saw a brush-ended tail whisk out of view. "King!" Jack cried. The train gave another lurch. This one was different, sidelong, as though the engine had been sideswiped by a bus. The room tilted right, threatening to topple sideways, and Jack turned to grab the railing. As he spun around, his eyes fixed on something that had not been there a moment before. Rammed straight through the wall like a harpoon, a barbed pole had pierced the engine, as black as coal and thick as a tree trunk. As quickly as he had spotted it, the pole jerked heavily, its barbs caught the wall, and the train lurched to the left. But this lurch was continual, gradual, as though the pole was being reeled in on a winch. The engine began to lean heavily to the left. The moan of the wheels fighting the track was as loud and mournful as a whale's song. Legs numb with fright and unsteady on the slick, sloping floor, Jack hobbled toward the gap in the rear of the engine again, moving paw over paw along the side rail. Reaching the gap, he sucked in a lungful of smoky air and bellowed with all his might, "King! King, please help me!" Just as he was inhaling another poisonous lungful, a thick padded paw, larger than Jack's head, reached down from above the gap.
"Take my paw!"
a deep voice beckoned.
"Quickly!"
Jack jumped as high as he could and caught the paw with both of his own. Immediately, he felt himself being jerked upward. He let out a cry as he flew up over the lip of the roof. Another enormous paw caught his waist and pulled him down into a horizontal bear hug. The lion lay across the roof on his back, clutching Jack to his chest as if the bunny were a toddler. The train continued to tip, steeper and steeper. The wheels gave a final, ear-piercing scream. The engine derailed. It was like a dream, a surreal dream where every detail was sharper than it would be in real life. He was gliding through the air, aware of the glint of sunlight bouncing off beads of dew in the grass far below his feet. He could smell the grass, even see little white insects hopping around between the blades. King's arms were wrapped around him, the tight weave of the fabric so clear it was as if he saw it through a magnifying glass. He could hear the train engine toppling behind them, roaring like a vacuum over sand. And just ahead he saw a stone chapel. They had been thrown right toward it, much too quickly. He didn't remember passing out, nor did he remember vomiting, but the smell of it was the first thing he recognized. He opened his eyes. The air was thick with dust. He seemed to be indoors, in a building made of stone. As if by an electric shock, Jack was suddenly awake and alert. He was alive, which meant King of Hearts had saved him. He knew he would. His eyes darted around, eagerly searching out his savior. There was movement everywhere. Some of them must be reporters, he considered. King would be talking to the reporters, or else checking with the passengers of the train. Jack rubbed the dust from his eyes, blinking in the haze. It was difficult to see in here. He perked his ears up. Only he didn't hear the sound of reporters asking questions or describing the scene. What he heard instead were the sounds of chaos. Crackling fire, a stone wall crumbling to the ground, and voices. Scared voices. Some were far off, grinding harshly through walkie-talkies. Some were much clearer, sobbing and screaming. Blurry movements soon registered as figures pacing around in front of half-shattered windows of stained glass. Jack became aware of arms supporting his bottom, and a shoulder on which his head was now resting. Looking down, he saw a long pink tail protruding from below a tan sport coat, vomit dribbling down the fabric. With a feeble groan, he leaned back, craned his neck, and saw the side of Dr. Walraven's face. The doctor turned slightly, returning Jack's gaze. He didn't smile. He simply turned his eyes back to the now sunny morning and stepped toward the damp grass outside. Jack looked around again. King must be here somewhere. And then he found him. The train engine was sunk into the earth, a spider's web of shattered stones at its base. And from beneath the engine, a brush-ended tail lay draped across the stone. He looked away immediately, his eyes searching for something, anything. They fell upon a sapling framed in a stone archway, like a work of art. A beam of sunlight bedazzled the gemstones of dew on its little leaves. It was a weak, lonely little plant, but the sight of it protruding from the rich brown soil filled Jack's heart, took the tremors from his paws, lulled him once again to sleep. "You look very handsome, my boy." Dr. Walraven had said this 3 times already, and while he knew the rat was trying to ease the silence, Jack couldn't help frowning at his own reflection. He looked stupid. Everyone looked stupid in a bow tie, but he looked worse, like a long-eared ventriloquist dummy. He turned his head and looked out the hotel window into the sunny morning, a sight in stark contrast with his own screaming insides. King was dead, his body retrieved, placed in a box to be planted in the ground, and all because of Jack. If he had stayed in the passenger car, if he had minded his own business, if he hadn't needed saving, King would have had time to get to safety. He, Jack, had taken away those precious seconds and cost King his life. He looked again at his own reflection, hating himself in the stupid way he looked. Tears poured into his furry cheeks. "Hey now," Dr. Walraven said as he knelt beside the bunny. I don't want to wear this, Jack said. I hate this stupid tie. I wouldn't have to wear it if I'd stayed with you. I wouldn't have to be in this stupid tie. You wouldn't either. Nobody would. No ties, no flowers, none of it. If I had just stayed with you. He began to sob and fell against the doctor's shoulder, his arms stiffly at his sides. Alan, who sat at the edge of the nearest bed, watched them silently, hardly seeming to breathe. No, no, the doctor said, drawing the bunny into a tight embrace, then pulling him away to meet his eyes. None of this was your fault. I know you won't understand this now, but sometimes you have to lose in order to win. He smiled, but seeing the confused look on Jack's face, he continued. King died to protect all of us. Nothing you did changed the way things would have turned out. Do you understand? Jack nodded, although in truth he didn't understand at all, and he didn't think Dr. Walraven did either. He was the boy who killed King of Hearts. The tears came again. Will you make me go back? He asked between hiccups of breath. Are you going to take me back to Mrs. Punt's? Dr. Walraven gave Jack's bow tie one last tug, then put both paws on the bunny's shoulders. No, Jack, he said, looking toward Alan with an encouraging smile. You're with us now.